Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Barsanti. I am the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you again to tonight's Fireside Chat. Tonight we're joined by Nicole Eustace, and I'm going to be introducing her a little bit more in a moment. But before I do a little bit of housekeeping, we'll have Nicole up in a moment. She's going to be sharing a presentation with us. I would maybe use your speaker view in Zoom to get her presentation at its full size. We will have some questions at the end, and I would encourage you to use the Q&A function that's sort of down here on your Zoom screen to ask your questions. And if you put them in the, see them, and we can't see you. So if you raise your hand, we definitely can't see you. Way that we're doing this Zoom tonight. So let me also say that the library company is going to have its first event we've had in a long time. It's going to be masked. You'll have to wear your mask and you'll have to be socially distant. But if you come down to the library company next Tuesday, we're doing a program about John Marshall. Robert Strauss is going to be talking about his book called The Final Founder, a book about John Marshall. So we may even get to see you again in person next week. We're looking forward to that. Our next Fireside Chat is a week from tonight, and it's Philadelphia's own Tom Nichols, who's going to be talking about his new book, From Mother Divine to the Corner Swami, which is about religious cults in Philadelphia. So that will be very, very interesting. And the last event I wanted to mention, another in-person event on August 27th. I think it's on the 27th. Check our website, but we're actually going to be screening a movie that is in conjunction with our current exhibition called Sea and Coal. That program, I believe, is on a Friday, the 27th, but check our event page and our social media feeds. But it will be a live event and a wonderful documentary about coal that will help to sort of close out our Sea and Coal exhibition. But tonight we have Nicole Eustace joining us. Nicole is got her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania back in 2001, and is no stranger to the Library Company. In fact, tonight she's talking about her new book, which is called Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America. And this is a book that we'll talk to her a little bit about it later, but she actually did some of the research for this book at the Library Company. That's really what we hope for these fireside chats, is to be able to show you the kinds of research and the kinds of work that our scholars are doing. So this is a great example. At the moment, the Nicole of History at New York University. She received her BA in History distinction from Yale in 1994. And as I just said, PhD in History from Penn in 2001. Her first teaching position was at Rutgers University in Camden from 2001 to 2002. At NYU, she directs the NYU Atlantic History Workshop and teaches in both the Early American History and the History of Women and Gender programs. She is the author of Passion is the Gale, Emotion, Power, and the Coming of the American Revolution, 1812, War and the Passions of Patriotism, and co-editor of the essay collection, Warring for America, Cultural Contests in the Era of 1812, co-edited with Frederica Toot. Her articles and essays have appeared in the American Historical Review, the Journal of American History, the William and Mary Quarterly, and the Journal of Social History. Her new book is called Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America. It's published by Liverite and W.W. Norton. It was listed by the Library Journal Books and Authors to Know and Titles to Watch in 2021. It was listed in the top 12 biographies for April by editors at Amazon and awarded a starred review from Kirkus Reviews. So we're really looking forward to Nicole talking about her book tonight, welcoming her back to the Library Company community if we're not welcoming her back in person. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Dr. Basanti, and thank you, Ms. Brock, for all your help with the logistics. I just thought I would start off. I'll share my screen, and this is nothing very exciting yet, but I do have some fun stuff to show you. Share, here we go. Okay, so there's my name and my affiliation and today's date. But I did want to start off by mentioning that, like the Library Company itself, I currently live in Lenapehoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, which remain important culturally to Native peoples to this day. And the book that I want to share with you is very much about the intersection of Native cultures of Pennsylvania and European ones, and what happened when they collided. The book is called Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America. And if any of you Library Company fans have been to the library in person, you will probably recognize my gorgeous cover image because it does hang over the desk. The original painting of the Philadelphia skyline does hang over the desk at the Library Company. And it was painted just about exactly at the same time as the story that I'm telling in this book. So it's a perfect cover image and one I was thrilled to be able to use. Okay, so let's get to it. Let me tell you a little bit about this story. In February of 1722, a pair of fur traders from colonial Pennsylvania, brothers named John and Edmund Cartledge, fell into a dispute with a Seneca hunter who was named Sawantini. And what I'm showing you here as the first image is a survey of the settlement at Conestoga, where John Cartledge lived. And if you look sideways, there's his name, John Cartledge. So he was a fur trader in Conestoga on the Susquehanna River, just at the juncture here with the Conestoga Creek. He and his brother Edmund got into a fight with a Seneca hunter named Sawantini. They had been drinking and bargaining around a campfire on a winter night, and the night ended badly. They assaulted Sawantini outside of his cabin, and they left him for dead. They rode hard back to John's house on the Susquehanna River. Sawantini staggered into his cabin, where he collapsed onto a bearskin rug, where his wife, a Shawnee woman whose name was Winnie Piwayata, tended to him as he lingered through the night, only to die around dawn. The loss of Sawantini plunged his community into mourning, a condition that generations of Iroquois storytellers described as being, quote, covered with night and wrapped in darkness. My book tells the story of the long shadow cast by Sawantini's death and the efforts of his community to find new light. Sawantini's killing catalyzed a crisis that endangered not only the peace of Pennsylvania, but the status of the British Empire in North America. It led people on all sides to debate the meaning of true justice. Should murder result in capital punishment? That was the colonists' basic belief. But Native peoples argued that there were other, better ways to redress the impact of mortal violence. They sought to engage colonists in rituals of condolence that were designed to relieve the trauma of grief and repair broken bonds of community. The debates about how to handle justice ended ultimately in a multilateral treaty agreement, which was signed in Albany, New York in September of 1722. People from 3 different British colonies participated with direct oversight from the British Crown, along with members of multiple different Native American nations. And here's the remarkable thing. That treaty is still in effect to this day. Although few people may have heard of it before, the Great Treaty of 1722, as it's called, is the oldest continuously recognized treaty in Anglo-American law. The treaty recorded the fate of the Cartledge brothers, but more than that, it preserved for posterity the indigenous ideals of justice. Now, in 1722, the year that this crime occurred, Pennsylvania was a colony in flux. It was at the heart of a rising but still very new British Empire, at the crossroads of multiple Native nations and confederacies. You may have already noticed, I mentioned that Sawantini, the man who was murdered, was a member of the Seneca, the 5 nations of Iroquois, or 5 nations of Haudenosaunee, as we would say today, and today there's 6 nations. He was a member of the Seneca. His wife, Mini Piwayata, was a member of the Shawnee, which is actually an Algonquin group, not an Iroquoian one. So this area around Conestoga is actually home base for a very diverse gathering of people, fractured by warfare, by slave raiding, by epidemic diseases. Native peoples of many nations had been fleeing trauma and gathering to forge new lives and communities near Conestoga Creek. Pennsylvania's Susquehanna River Valley now included everyone from speakers of Algonquin languages, such as the Lenapes, also called the Delawares, or the Shawnees, to speakers of Iroquoian languages, such as the Seneca. And at Conestoga, as I've just been saying, these people gathered together as one community. And this was where John Cartledge, and here I'm showing you his signature, which is the closest we can get to a portrait of a man. This is where John Cartledge built himself a lavish home where he could conduct the fur trade. And if you take a look at that signature, you'll see it's quite a fine script, and it really indicates an educated and well-to-do man of his time. Okay. When the Cartledge brothers attacked Sawantini, they not only committed a crime, they set in motion a diplomatic crisis that had the potential to imperil an empire. So far, the British had been confined to a very tight territory, just edging the Atlantic Ocean. But they aimed at nothing less than control of the entire continent of North America. That was not going to happen if they antagonized Native people beyond endurance. The 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, along with other Native groups, were the ones who really were in control, from Lake Champlain to the Chesapeake Bay. And I'm showing you now a map of North America, but it's labeled a map of Louisiana and the River Mississippi. This is from an atlas published in London in 1721. And I've got a little blow up of this section here, because I hope you can read it. I just want you to see in 1721, this is how tiny Pennsylvania is. And the Iroquois are much bigger on this map than the colony of Pennsylvania. So this gives you a sense, I think, of the diplomatic and political sway and significance of the Iroquois in the minds of the British, let alone in the minds of Pennsylvania colonists. Okay, the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, who would soon become 6, also known as the Iroquois, were based in the area that we would now call New York, but which you can see here really was Iroquois at that time. Because Sawantaney, the murdered man, belonged to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the attack on him imperiled peace across Eastern North America. Many colonial wars fought between colonists and the continent's first inhabitants began with an isolated act of murder. And so Sawantaney's death really provoked a crisis. Now, colonial officials first found out about the attack when a mixed delegation of Native Americans and colonists from the area where Sawantaney lived went to Maryland, because he actually lived, you can see here, this says Susquehannos, there's always interesting alternate spellings, but he lived around here. Here's Conestoga, an Indian fort, and so he lived right near this Maryland border. And again, think about the significance of Conestoga, that it is noted on a map made in London in 1721. Okay, so the first thing they did was actually go not to colonial Philadelphia, to the capital of Pennsylvania, but rather to Maryland. And that delegation described, quote, the death of one of the chief men of the Seneca Nation. They explained that a man, quote, called Sawantaney was killed by 2 of the Conestogan traders called John and Edmund Cartledge, who immediately fled on this occasion. A Maryland militia captain forwarded that information to the Capitol in Baltimore, and he warned that the crime could have region-wide repercussions, saying, quote, the consequence of this imprudent and base action seems very much to threaten this, our province, with an Indian war. But even as Marylanders were bracing for violence, they were hoping for an easier resolution. The militia captain told his superiors, quote, some Indians say that if the murderer is brought to justice, the Senecas will require no more. The governor of Maryland latched on to the possibility, and he asked the captain to inform the delegation of Native people that, quote, although the murderers are under the Pennsylvania government, and we are in no ways concerned in it, we shall write to the governor of Pennsylvania that they may have reparations for the injury done them. And that word reparations is rather significant here, because rather than any other form of punishment, Native people explained to the Marylanders that they were looking for economic restitution, as well as ritual condolences. And so this idea of reparations really originates in the 18th century sources. It's not just kind of a 21st century summary of the attitude of Native people. It's actually the language being used at the time. Maryland officials grasped the essence of the Native American attitude far more quickly than did their counterparts in colonial Pennsylvania. Back in Philadelphia, they assumed that the only way to keep the peace would be to offer Indigenous people, quote, the full measure of English justice. And they had a pretty strong idea of what English justice required, because William Penn had died in 1718, just 4 years before this crime occurred. And upon his death, a new governor arrived in Pennsylvania, an Anglican man, William Keith Baronet. William Keith, appointed by Penn's widow, who was also Anglican and not Quaker. William Keith was a highborn man who had fallen on hard times. And here, oops, sorry. Here's a portrait of Sir William Keith in his knightly coat of armor. He was highborn. He'd fallen on hard times. He arrived in Pennsylvania determined to assert his authority and establish a fortune for himself. And so the first step that he took was an overhaul of the colony's penal code. He wanted to bring it into closer alignment with the English code. William Penn's original charter from 1682 had made only 2 transgressions punishable by death, murder and treason. But by the time that Keith's legal revisions were finished in 1718, the colony's code listed more than a dozen crimes that were punishable by public execution, including robbery, burglary, witchcraft, and manslaughter. So although Keith could never have guessed that the new penalties would first come into play when colonists stood accused of killing a native man, in the event, he felt forced by circumstance to apply the laws that he had just helped to institute. Keith and his fellow colonists regarded the crime as the work of an isolated set of criminals and its resolution as a matter of simply imposing the proper punishment. When Pennsylvania's settler colonists heard that Native people had a completely different perspective on how to resolve this crisis, their first reaction was just to dismiss the Native position out of hand. Now, Philadelphia officials did not learn of the attack on Sawantini until more than a month after those in Maryland did. They found out when a pair of ordinary colonists carried news of the crime downriver from Conestoga to Philadelphia on March 6th of 1722. At that point, they leapt into action. Governor Keith charged the colony's official secretary, James Logan, with meeting leaders of the Native community at Conestoga to work out what should be done. The Pennsylvania Council charged Logan to determine, quote, the most effectual and the cheapest way to preserve the friendship of the Indians and to quell any disturbances which may hereafter possibly happen upon any such extraordinary events, end quote. Colonial officials believed that their own security depended on maintaining peaceful relationships with the multiple Native peoples that they lived among, and especially, of course, with the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee. Nevertheless, they did not like the idea of paying reparations, and they did like the idea of showing off their penal severity. I'm now showing you, just by way of illustration, a map that James Logan himself made based on information that he got from a French fur trader named Michael Bisaillon. And what is so interesting here, it's a very rudimentary map of the Ohio River Valley region, but you'll see it says Ohio rises among ye Iroquois. And down here is Virginia, and up here is a portage across the Miami. So in this very rudimentary understanding that Pennsylvania colonists have of Native cultures of North America, they know the Iroquois are the people that they're going to have to answer to. So Logan rode into Conestoga, called a meeting with the people there, and promised, quote, we will suffer no injury to be done to any of you without punishing the offenders according to our laws. When he made that guarantee, Logan thought that he was giving them equal justice, but that seemingly generous guarantee of equality, as we've just been saying, flew in the face of Native expectations and ideals. According to the testimony of Sawantini's wife, Winnie-P-Wayata, the Seneca man's dying words were, quote, my friends have killed me. Winnie-P-Wayata testified that those were her husband's last words when she met with Logan at Conestoga. And those words were incredibly important and significant. They not only indicated that the Cartledges had been friends as well as trading partners with Sawantini. More than that, they indicated that for diplomatic purposes, the Native people of the region wanted this crime to be considered a violent accident amongst friends and not an act of war between enemies. And so the statement that Sawantini had said, "My friends have killed me," was not so much a testament to a personal relationship, although it probably was a personal relationship, but it was less a testament to these personal ties than it was a statement about the collective attitude of Native people towards this crisis and the fact that they did not want it to lead to a wider rupture in community relations. That was very much in accordance with the practices of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee. They had created something called the Great Law of Peace that they used in order to cut off the violence of grief by assuaging it with the comfort of condolences. This was the kind of condolence ceremony complex that the Haudenosaunee had initiated and that had become quite influential amongst various Native groups, including even the Shawnee, to whom Winnie Piwayata owed her belonging. Okay, so this process of making material, emotional, spiritual amends was called covering the dead. That was the official term. Rather than seeking to punish individual perpetrators, Native peoples preferred to repair community bonds. And the next image that I'm going to show you is one of my favorites from the book, and it's fun to be able to show it on a Zoom slide because you can see it in color. This comb was carved from antlered horn, we believe, by a Native person around the year 1700, and it was found by archaeologists working for the Pennsylvania Museum and Historical Commission at Conestoga, right at the place where this meeting took place. So this piece of material evidence is one of the kind of strongest pieces of evidence we have to really, I think, symbolize in our minds, to help us vividly picture the Native idea of how you could create community across nations. You see a Quaker in a kind of a very stereotypical tri-cornered hat, linking hands across the frame with a apparently Native man. And it's fascinating that each man is very self-contained in his own section of the comb. They haven't blended into one, but they are perfect mirror images of one another. They're in perfect harmony with one another. Sawantini's death provided a dramatic occasion for the region's indigenous inhabitants to commit to uniting with Pennsylvanians as one people. For Native peoples of the River Valley, forced to confront the countervailing pressures of many different colonial and Native groups, Sawantini's loss brought the chance to gain new ties of community. By using the exchange of formalized condolences, they could turn disparate peoples into symbolic kin. And this, of course, was the basis of the mourning rituals of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, of which Sawantini, as a Seneca man, was an acknowledged member. So even as Logan was meeting with members of the Native community at Conestoga, Native go-betweens were traveling from Susquehanna to the Hudson to alert the leaders of the 5 nations there of the death of their kinsmen. All Native spokespeople tried to deliver the same message, from Haudenosaunee messengers in the New York area to local leaders hailing from Conestoga. All Native people discouraged the colonists from imprisoning, much less executing, the cartilages. And now I have another map from this exact era, from 1721. Please note the only illustration on the map is of the Indian fort on Susquehanna, otherwise known as Conestoga. And the other thing that is fascinating on this map, it's probably too tiny for you to make out, but you'll take my word for it. Here in the explanation, when they explain how to use the scale of English miles to estimate distance across the map, their kind of sample calculation was how to calculate the distance from the Susquehanna to the Hudson. So this access of Iroquois is really kind of the axis of influence, if you will, in this world. Beginning with Logan's first trip to Conestoga, one Native community leader after another argued for clemency for the Cartledges. One leader at Conestoga stepped forward as a central figure. He was a man that colonists referred to as Captain Civility. This Captain Civility soon became a key player in the case. He served as a linguistic translator, a Native spokesperson, and a diplomatic intermediary. And I want to pause just for a moment here to talk about his name. His Susquehannock name was recorded as Taquataran Sali, but colonists called him Captain Civility. Other historians have heard that name and thought, that's a weird nickname. Is it a sarcastic colonial joke because they often referred to Native people as quote unquote savages? Or were they giving him kind of a backhanded compliment? They noted that he was quite civilized in his behavior, and so they singled him out with this title. In fact, what I discovered through the course of my research is that Captain Civility was not a personal name at all. It was a job title. And it was a job title used by Susquehannock Indians going back at least 3 generations to 17th century Maryland. And I believe that that title, Captain Civility, represents a 17th century Maryland colonist who would have been a native English speaker, that it represents that English speaker's best effort to translate this native job position that really didn't exist in English culture, a position for someone who was trying to draw people together from different communities into civil society. Susquehannock peoples created a job position for someone who was tasked with trying to draw people together to create new ties and new networks across different peoples to create civil community, so that Captain Civility is the person in charge of making civil society. Well, Captain Civility and John Cartledge were neighbors. They had known each other for years before John's attack on Sawantini. The record shows that they had traded together, even translated together at cross-cultural meetings. And in fact, the earliest specific information about Captain Civility's reaction to Sawantini's death comes in a sworn deposition about a meeting held between him and John Cartledge, because John Cartledge actually began trying to make amends on his own before Philadelphia officials ever got involved. According to witnesses, Captain Civility met John and Edmund Cartledge in a conference at John's house. Quote, and at the said council, the said Captain Civility, on the part and behalf of the Indians, said that at the first settlement of this country by the Christians and the Indians, they were 2 people. But after the coming of William Penn, he made the 2 people one flesh. And so they had continued in the same chain of friendship ever since. Therefore, Civility assured those assembled, the Indians did not want the murder to disrupt community relations between Native peoples and settler colonists. This apparently very surprising speech on Civility's part actually just amplified comments that he had been making for years. Back in 1720, just 2 years before, he made a speech in which he reminded colonists that William Penn had promised them that they would be, quote, one body, one blood, one heart, and one head. Meeting with Logan in 1722, he ultimately said that Penn had made the 2 people one flesh. So again, remember, Sawantini himself said, my friends have killed me. That statement was very much in accord with this commitment to maintaining ties of community, even in the midst of crises. Sawantini, in fact, was known among Native people, not as a man given to anger, but rather as one celebrated for being civil. His friend and fellow leader, Captain Civility, testified to James Logan that Sawantini was, quote, a warrior, a civil man of very few words. Like Captain Civility himself, whose peaceable role was conveyed by his job title, that of a leader charged with promoting unity amongst disparate peoples, Sawantini's reputation for being, quote, civil meant much more than just that he was pleasant or well-mannered. Sawantini, like Civility, was a leader who devoted his life to trying to bring the peoples of the Susquehanna region together in communion. As a warrior, he fought battles, but as a civil leader, he sought to spread peace. And his dying wish was that the altercation between him and the Cartledges would not disrupt the peace of the community. Now, Anglo-Pennsylvanians could hardly imagine the kinds of unified ties that Native peoples were striving for. The governor of Pennsylvania, Sir William, delayed traveling to Conestoga himself as long as he could. He finally turned up in April, only to say again that colonists were treating the crime seriously and following English legal precedents. He said that John and Edmund Cartledge, quote, would be tried by English laws so soon as a messenger from the Senecas returns, or any proof can be had that the Indian is dead or was actually killed by them. This is quite a remarkable statement from the governor. Keith knew that he was in a pickle if he was going to follow English law, because not only was murder punishable by execution, so was manslaughter. If Sawantini had died, John and Edmund Cartledge's lives were hanging in the balance. And so Keith sought to cast doubt on whether or not Sawantini had died at all the while promising that he was going to give equal justice. That was quite a tricky balancing act. By July of 1722, however, leaders of the Five Nations based in the New York area confirmed their collective approval of Captain Civility's position. The Haudenosaunee demanded, indirectly but unmistakably, that Pennsylvania leaders deliver ritual condolences and substantial gifts in person at a treaty conference that they were convening in Albany, New York, in that coming September. As Civility translated for the colonists, the Haudenosaunee said, quote, the great king of the Five Nations is sorry for the death of the Indian that was killed, for he was his own flesh and blood. He believes that the governor is sorry, but all will be made up when the governor comes to Albany. The governor of New England has sent them great presents, 30 bundles of goods, all tied up. They are not yet opened. When the governors come all together to Albany, they will open and divide them. The Five Nations will be glad to see the governors. And not only did they make this unequivocal speech, demanding a diplomatic visit from the governor of Pennsylvania and asserting that they wanted this ritual process of reparation in the terms of economic reparations and repair in the sense of emotional and spiritual rituals. Not only did they make that statement, but they gave a kind of a very unmistakable signal. They had their messenger, a man named Sachichoa, wrap a string of wampum around Governor William Keith's arm and symbolically pull him towards Albany. So there wasn't much at that point that Governor Keith could do to avoid a trip. Native people did not want to see the Cartledges incarcerated or executed, and they told Keith that at this same July meeting, focusing on John, who was the more prominent brother. The messenger Sachichoa, with help in translation from Captain Civility, said that the leaders of the Five Nations, quote, desire that John Cartledge may not die for this. They would not have him killed. John Cartledge has been a long time bound, and they desire he may be bound no longer. Going into detail, Sachichoa said that the chief, quote, desires John Cartledge may not be put to death for it, nor that the governor should be angry and spare him for some time, but put him to death afterwards. They'd taken note of the slippery way that the Pennsylvanians were handling the case, with Keith saying, on the one hand, we're going to give you equal justice, and on the other hand saying, oh, I'm actually not sure the man died, and anyway, I don't know what the Five Nations want us to do. They're being very clear. They don't want him executed at any point. This was capped off with a broader statement of principle. Sachi Choa declared, quote, "One life is enough to be lost. There should not two die," end quote. With those words, Sawantini did more than just announce the Haudenosaunee position on this particular case. He articulated a broader Iroquois worldview that was wholly at odds with European expectations. Ultimately, Native negotiators, aided by Pennsylvania officials' own prejudiced preference not to punish a colonist for killing an Indian, succeeded in forcing the Pennsylvanians to follow their protocols to the letter. By the end of July, Governor Keith agreed to undertake a journey to Albany to deliver Pennsylvanians' condolences in person. He requested, and the Assembly granted, the sum of 100 pounds, quote, "for presents to the Indians, without which 'tis conceived, the journey itself will be to very little purpose," end quote. As importantly, Native peoples succeeded in freeing the cartlages. At the Albany Council in 1722, the Iroquois spelled out their view of the case and its significance in unmistakable language. At that conference, they said, quote, "As to the accident of one of our friends being killed by some of your people, which has happened by misfortune and against your will, we say that as we are all in peace, we think it hard that the person who killed our friend and brother should suffer, and we do in the name of all the Five Nations forgive that offense. We desire you would likewise forgive it, and that the men who did it may be released from prison, that they may be set at a liberty to go whither they please, and we shall esteem that as a mark of your regard and friendship for the Five Nations, and as a further confirmation of this treaty." Well, both John Cartledge and his brother Edmund were in fact allowed to go free. In a poignant twist, John Cartledge caught a fever while he was still imprisoned in Philadelphia, awaiting trial. He died at home shortly after his release. But his brother Edmund resumed residence at Conestoga, where he continued to trade for Indian furs and amass more Indian land for the rest of his life. And this image that I'm showing you now is a land deed signed in 1725, and I have circled Edmund Cartledge's name. And you will see that the Native person who, quote, signed this document, signed with a pictogram, and it's just this exquisitely accurate and delicate drawing of a fox. And I just did a little grab off Google of an image of a fox because as a suburbanite, I don't really know my fox physiology very well, but I was really struck by the way that this Native artist got the angles of the legs, and the volume of the tail and the set of the ears, even the shape of the snout, just so beautifully and accurately done. When the English boarded tall ships bound for America, they thought that civility was their most important cargo. The founding document of Pennsylvania, the official charter granted by the English crown establishing William Penn's authority over the colony, declared that he was being granted that charter out of a desire to enlarge our English empire, out of a desire to promote useful commodities, i.e. trade, and in order to, quote, "reduce the savage natives by gentle and just manners to the love of civil society and Christian religion." Crown and colonists alike just assumed that civility was theirs, something they could put on the ship and bring with them to the colonies. They had no conception that Native peoples had their own highly developed traditions of civility, which were very much at odds with English expectations and assumptions. The English thought they could divide the world into the civilized and the savage. but as the life and work of, quote, Captain Civility so clearly symbolizes. The English were utterly mistaken in their belief that they alone understood the concept of how to live in civil society, much less that civility was a uniquely English achievement. Indian emphasis on restorative healing for communities contrasted greatly with the English stress on punitive measures for individual perpetrators. In the first decades of the 18th century, the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, along with the diverse members of the community at Conestoga, retained significant influence over the conduct of intramural justice. Civility's calls for the English first to claim responsibility for Sawantanie's loss, and then to appreciate and apply Indigenous norms of emotional and material justice was repeated again and again until it was finally included in the ritual surrounding the Great Treaty of 1722. And as I shared at the beginning of this talk, that agreement just happens to be the earliest ratified treaty between Indigenous peoples and members of Anglo-America, now the United States. It's still recognized, that is still recognized by the US State Department. It's the oldest continuously recognized treaty. This makes it part of our national inheritance, our national legacy. And I think it's part of our past that's really ripe for rediscovery. So I'll stop sharing my screen with you now. Thank you so much for being with me tonight to hear a little bit about my book. And I would love to hear from you and answer some questions.
Nicole, thank you. That was fascinating. And again, a really nice, to those library company members who were here who would remember the Ghost River Project and another episode in Conestoga Manor. Good to have more context around that. A couple of questions have come in through the Q&A, and I'll start with those. One is a question from Nancy Piwawar, who asks how you got interested in this story.
Thank you so much for the question. And I see that the next question is, how long after this incident did the attitude of conciliation continue? And I'm going to take the 2 questions together because they're really related. So those of you who know about the Ghost River Project know that it tells the story of the ultimate massacre of surviving members of the Conestoga community in what's sometimes called the Paxton Massacre. That occurred in 1763. If I have the date right, I think I do. I'm actually just toggling in my mind. Was it 63 or 4 or 5?
I think we're close enough, Nicole.
Yeah, okay, sorry. To me, it matters. Anyway, Pennsylvania colonists wound up slaughtering every last member of the peaceful community at Conestoga. So that's what's going to happen, give or take 40 years after this case happens. And I wrote about the Paxton Massacre in my first book, which you'll have to forgive me. I did start as a dissertation in 1997, so I've been at this for a couple decades, and some of the dates are starting to fuzz on the edges on me. But I knew that that's how the story ended. I knew that the attitude of conciliation didn't continue. And I kind of thought to myself, well, I know things were fairly peaceful under the leadership of William Penn, and I know they're going to end in unmitigated disaster, really in horror, in the 1760s. So, you know, when do things start to change? And so I just thought, let me start looking at Pennsylvania records right after William Penn dies. So I started reading the provincial council minutes of Pennsylvania around 1718. And I've always been interested in the history of emotion. And I'm interested in questions of savagery and civility. They have come up a lot in my prior work. So, and I'm always a little skeptical of the colonial assumption that they are the civilized ones. So that's kind of the mindset that I had. And I start reading the provincial council minutes. And I stumble across this murder case where the native spokesman is named Captain Civility. And I just was rocked. I mean, stop the presses. Who is this guy? Why is he called that? What is he doing here? And I just got more and more and more intrigued with the case. And the records really are very, very rich. I was able to kind of cross-check between official government minutes, the private correspondence of lots of members of the Maryland and Pennsylvania communities, as well as colonists in New York, to kind of get a background sense of what else was going on. There are newspapers being published, so I can find out a lot about kind of current events, what people are reading, what people are thinking about. And then I was able to also weave in all of this incredibly rich archaeological evidence from the Conestoga region, think about Native philosophy as it's been researched by other historians, as it's been communicated by Haudenosaunee informants, talking with scholars, and kind of bring in traditional stories and teachings of Native people with all of these other kinds of records. And I just became completely entranced in this world and just really wanted to be able to tell this story.
That's fascinating, Nicole. I can understand that once you get to Captain Civility, there's kind of no walking away, right?
Exactly.
Let me ask you a little bit about the work that you did at the library company. What were the kinds of resources you used at the library company in researching this book?
Great. I'm very, very happy to be asked that. So I mentioned that just now, that one of the things that was fascinating for me about this project was being able to figure out what people at the time were reading. Because I kind of wanted to know the full cultural context of what was going on. So I would look at newspapers, and I think I'll go back to screen sharing for a second here, just for the fun of it. Although this might be a little blurry, but this is a shot from the American Weekly Mercury from 1722. It's an advertisement for a bookshop. There was a bookshop run by Andrew Bradford, the printer, in 1722, and I could figure out some of the things that Andrew Bradford was selling. One of the things that he was selling was a manual for justices of the peace that explained how you were supposed to prosecute a crime like murder. And he published that in June, just as the Cartledges were in jail with their lives hanging in the balance. So that's really, that kind of thing is fun. And I was able to, at the library company, look at the actual manual for the justices of the peace and kind of really get my hands dirty and figure out what that really looked like. I also was just interested in what else was being printed in Philadelphia at the time. Believe it or not, in 1722, printing is still such a new technology that there were only a couple dozen things printed in the entire year in 1722. And one of the other things that was printed was an atlas. The American Almanac for the Year of Christian Account, 1722, by Titan Leeds. And I really got interested in this almanac because for me, it symbolized the fact that while we might be imagining the 18th century as a time of enlightenment and, you know, it's amazing, they've got these tall ships, they can cross the Atlantic and they're administering an empire, but in fact, they believe in astrology, hook, line, and sinker. And Titan Leeds prophesied that there would be a murder. And here you go. Because the moon is in a particular house, it showeth murder. And there's an eclipse near the dragon's tail, so I'll predict imprisonment too. So I found that very atmospheric. And I first found that Titan Leeds Almanac in an online database, which you can access through the library company's website, Evans Early American Imprints. I first looked at it online, but of course, being an archive rat, I wanted to see the original, which the library company owns. So I went to the library company and I called for the original and I started flipping through it and I saw that it was used as a daybook. Sorry, it was used as a daybook and someone had made notes in it. And I'm flipping through, and most of the notes are kind of boring, frankly. A lot about like we put some new posts in next to the pasture. And then I flip towards the end of the book and I read, I set out for Albany ye 12th day exceeding hot. And I realized that this almanac that was used as a diary was taken to the conference at Albany that resolved the murder case that the almanac predicted. That's one of those like unbelievable research finds. And the digital copy of the library company catalog didn't say who kept this diary. But I've been working in the library company and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania literally since 1994. I kind of thought I recognized that handwriting. I kind of thought that it belonged to this guy, Isaac Norris. And I called over Jim Green, who was still the librarian at the time. I said, Jim, is this Isaac Norris's handwriting? He said, of course it is. Doesn't it say that in the catalog? And I said, no. And I showed him the electronic record and he said, that's very strange. I think that has to be Isaac Norris. Surprised we don't have a provenance note. And he went to the card catalog, which is still there, the old-fashioned paper card catalog and the beautiful wooden card cabinet on the wall of the library company, and pulled out the card. And sure enough, the original card did in fact attribute that diary to Isaac Norris. But no one had ever before noticed that he took it with him to the Albany conference, which he did because James Logan was unable to go. So Isaac Norris subbed for him and did a lot of secretarial work at the conference. So that's the kind of thing that just makes research fun. You can't predict these things when you start, but they really make the whole process fascinating.
That's a fantastic story, Nicole. Also, I have to say, August 12th, very hot day, right?
That's right.
300 years ago to the day.
Another piece of serendipity. That's funny. That's great. I hadn't even noticed that myself.
Yeah. So, but I love that story. Like, there's so many great kind of library company tropes embedded in that story. You know, the salvation of Jim Green. You know, recognizing it and finding it in the card catalog. There are a lot of good stories there, and also just that idea of, if you want to find out what people were actually looking at in Philadelphia in the 1720s, of course, you know, library company is 10 years after that, but still, you know, we have those collections and those materials that help to tell that story. So thank you for that. I also wanted to ask you about your writing process and how you go about, and how, particularly with this book, it's clearly there's a very strong narrative, and in your just sort of describing the story, you can really feel that kind of narrative arc in what you're talking about. But yeah, how did you approach this book, and what was your process like?
With this book, I really wanted to write a book that could be something like a nonfiction novel. Nothing is invented here. Every single detail that I give in the book is accurate as I can possibly make it. And there are loads and loads of footnotes to show kind of a breadcrumb trail of how I got any given detail. But I wanted to find a way to write nonfiction that would read almost as if it were fiction. And I had a lot of fun, both with, you know, big picture things like kind of trying to create some suspense. I did give away the ending just now to all of you in the talk, but you know, my sons and I always marvel. You manage to feel suspense over again anyway, even when you know the ending, because the characters don't know the ending. And if you identify strongly enough with them, you find yourself in suspense anyway. And everyone involved in this story, from the Cartledges to Governor Keith to James Logan to the native people of Conestoga, were in suspense for many, many months as they debated what was going to happen here. So I tried to frame the story in a suspenseful way. And then I tried to really bring out the humanity of these historical people as flesh and blood characters, and to show their world as much as I could. And you were kind enough to mention that it got selected as one of the best biographies by Amazon. In some ways, that's a little perplexing, because you would think that maybe they would have put it with histories. But the fact is, it really is a collective biography. Every other chapter is focused on a specific individual. You really get to know the people of Pennsylvania, not just the high figures like Sir William or Secretary Logan, but you learn all about John's servant boy, Jonathan Swindle, and what happened to him. You learn about unnamed Black enslaved people accused of robbery who were executed, summarily executed the same summer. You learn about the women of the colony, about a Dutch woman who managed to maintain her own property and become a translator, about James Logan's wife and what it was like to be pregnant in the sweltering summer of 1722. So I really kind of try to bring this world to life, to talk about people like Sachi Choa in a great deal of detail, as well as Wimi Piwayata and Takwataran Sali and some of these other native figures, so that you start to get a sense of these people in their world.
I wanted to, the characters you're talking about are all, for those of us sort of saturated in the library company story, there's so many familiar names. I did want to point out, not to embarrass her, but you mentioned James Logan, of course, is prominent in this, and his wife, Laura Keim, who's the director of Stenton, is on the Zoom. So all these things intersect.
I was very, very sad that Stenton wasn't built until after my story, because boy, would that have added some great details and atmosphere if I could have put Logan in Stenton during my story. Every time I know where someone is, I do talk about it. So I talk about the governor's mansion and, the courthouse and the market stalls, but Logan wasn't in Stenton yet, which when I was in grad school, I got to tour Stenton and go to some evening programs at Stenton. It's a great place.
Of course, Governor Keith is an infamous figure in the Franklin biography, where he gets sort of, Franklin doesn't have very much to say about him, certainly, but to hear about this part of his career, again, it adds more context.
It does, but it doesn't rehabilitate him. He is the villain of the piece.
No, it sort of compounds that. Yeah, he had some issues. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
Well, Nicole, our hour has passed. Thank you very, very much. This has really been a wonderful talk. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A to see if we have any last minute questions coming in. I think, how can people reach you, Nicole, if they want to?
You can easily find my email address online. It's nicole.eustace@nyu.edu. But if you Google me, you'll get it very easily.
I can even just put that in the chat before we go.
Sure. Great.
Anyway, thank you again, and I hope we get to see you again in Philadelphia. Back, when we're all back. Oh, look. It's been put, your email has been put into the chat. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So again, thank you, and everyone have a good night. And I hope that we get to see you again next week. I hope we get to see you in person. Check out our events page for more upcoming events.